Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the From Adversity to Abundance podcast. I am your host, Jamie Bateman, and I'm super pumped today to have with us Kevin Dahlstrom. Kevin is actually our second return guest on the show, so I'm thrilled to have Kevin. Kevin, how are you doing today?
Doing good. Hey, Jamie, excited to chat. Enjoyed our last chat a few months ago and ready to go again.
Yeah, and for the listener out there, we're not going to go too far into Kevin's backstory, but I highly recommend you listen to the first episode we did with Kevin, which I think, Kevin, you said out on the Twitter sphere somewhere that was the most comprehensive, I guess, rendition or story version of your history that's out there. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, we went deep. I mean, look, we're all a product of our upbringing, so it was fun to talk about sort of my upbringing and how it influenced who I am today. So yeah, I listen to that episode if you haven't, folks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I failed to say Kevin is a serial entrepreneur, founder, and a very good rock climber as well. And we may touch on that a little bit, but definitely listen to the first episode. We went deep, as you said, Kevin. We talked about some your upbringing and some maybe relationship challenges, and also some health struggles that I know you had as well. And then we got up to, we talked a lot about your quote unquote midlife crisis, where you left Texas and moved to Colorado. And not only that, quit your job, turned down a lot of money, and really changed things in your entire life as far as, all kinds of things.
Yeah, I mean, look, the quick summary of my background for folks who haven't listened to that last episode. So I was born and raised in Texas, had most of my career in Texas. And, I came from a pretty tough upbringing. And what that left me with was just a huge desire to have something different. And so I was the classic, kind of put my head down and grind and worked my way up the corporate ladder. And what ultimately happened, made it all the way to my 40s and ultimately realized I had built a life that looked really great on paper, like big house in the suburbs, beautiful family, job, 7-figure job, whatever. But it wasn't me. I was playing the role of some other guy who wasn't me. And so I did something that I think very few people do, but more people should do, which is I pulled the plug. I sort of rebooted everything, moved my family to Boulder, Colorado, which is where I live now. Rock climbing, as you mentioned, played a huge role. I like to be outdoors. And so Boulder is heaven on earth. It's like an adult playground if you're into the outdoors. That was 5 years ago. And, from a career standpoint, I think if there's any claim to fame that I have, it's that I've had a unique career in the sense that I've always had one foot in two worlds. So I am a multiple time founder with multiple exits. I've founded 4 companies, and I joke I've hit for the cycle. Like I've had everything from spectacular strikeouts all the way through one company went public. But I've also, through that process, ended up working for a couple of big public companies as the chief marketing officer. And so I have experience on sort of both sides. And it's actually interesting how each informs the other. You learn different lessons when you're, working for a big organization versus, starting in the proverbial garage in a startup. So that's kind of the quick synopsis. I have, my wife and I have been married for 26 years. I have 2 daughters, 16 and 18 years old, about to lose my first daughter to college. She's headed to New York exactly 1 month from now.
Okay.
So I'm kind of at that. I'm at an interesting stage of life. Oh, and by the way, I just recently sold my latest startup, which was called Swell. It was a fintech startup. It was a nice exit. And as a result of that, I'm, one of the roles that didn't make the transition to the acquirer was the CEO, who was me. And so as of May 31st, which is as we record this, is what, a month and a half ago, I'm not in a full-time operating role. Honestly, for the first time in like 30 years, I'm not really in a full-time operating role. The irony is, Jamie, I've been busier than ever. It's insane.
Is that right?
Because I've always got a lot of things going on the side. And I'm of course, doing a bunch of things. But it has been kind of great to just for a little bit, not
Yeah.
be in like day-to-day, trench warfare.
The grind. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I just listened to another podcast you were just on. I think you referenced the fact that you'll probably never retire. You're not really a retiring type person. But yeah, you're a doer, man. I mean, you're an
Yeah.
active guy. Go
Well,
ahead.
look, my whole shtick, if you follow me on Twitter at all, is
Yeah.
the concept of retirement becomes, at least what we traditionally consider retirement to be, kind of becomes absurd if you instead focus on just building the life you want now. And so I reached a point, fortunately, through a lot of work and luck, I reached a point years ago where my every day is I do things that I choose to do. Now, it's never perfect, right? There's always some degree of grind, no matter what you do, even if you
Sure.
are, quote unquote, retired. But once you've designed a life and implemented a life that is, just the way you want to spend your days anyway, then the concept of retirement sort of starts to become moot.
Yeah, absolutely. I just love the whole, I mean, I highly recommend the listener follow you on Twitter. Everything you put out is just well thought out, well articulated, and it's just so, I don't know, it's, you've got the long-term view, but it's also very practical, and people can take action right away. But as far as I just also have to give you, kudos for, people might say, oh, well, it's easy to walk away from a $1 million a year plus job or whatever, because I mean, he had all this money. Well, it's also really hard to turn down this massive paycheck that's coming in 2 weeks. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I've never been in that exact position. I have quit my W-2 as well, but that I think would be very difficult to do. So I think that's just that whole mindset and actually taking action on taking ownership of your life is really what you did. I just a lot of respect from me to you.
Yeah, I mean, well, and there's certainly some truth to the fact that, once you've accumulated some wealth, it's
Sure.
a little bit easier to make bold moves.
Sure.
But still, I mean, I think the lessons apply to any age. And I just posted something on Twitter actually this morning, saying, the old saying, the world belongs to the bold, is just so incredibly true. And often being bold just means, taking little tiny steps, like asking for something you want or taking a baby step toward a goal. Or sometimes it means making really big moves like I did years ago when I sort of rebooted my life. And it's scary. No matter where you sit on the wealth spectrum, it's scary. I mean, I walked away from a sum that was well into the 8 figures, just so your listeners kind of get a sense of that. It would have, it was not, it was a very meaningful chunk of my potential future wealth.
Sure.
But, ultimately, I'm 52 years old. And back then I was, in my mid 40s. And, I truly believe it's often said, and it starts to sound like a cliche, but it really is true, that time is our most valuable asset. And so the real question is, how are you going to spend your time? Of course, we have to pay the bills. But I think it turns out when people actually go through the exercise of thinking about, in an ideal world, how they would spend their time each day, it turns out that most of that stuff doesn't require that you be worth $10 million. You can, because ultimately, life is about, the most meaningful things in life are relationships and experiences. And neither of those things tend to cost a lot.
Absolutely. I love that perspective. That's awesome. And I also want to quickly mention your podcast, Kevin, which is called Compounding, right?
Yes. So it's the Compounding Podcast. You can find it. I think it's compoundingpod.com or on YouTube. And it's a labor of love. I'm taking a different direction than most podcasts. One is that I'll only do a podcast when I find a guest that I think is truly exceptional. So as a result of that, I've only done like 7 episodes over the past year. I also fly out to wherever my guest is. I'll fly out and do it live, just because I think it's a little bit different dynamic live. Sure. So recommend you check it out. It's I've had some fantastic guests. My most recent one was maybe my favorite. It was Carissa Moore, who is arguably she's definitely the best female surfer of all time, arguably the top surfer in the world, man or woman right now, and just an amazing human being. So a lot of life lessons from that podcast.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'll give you my address so you can fly into BWI. No, I'm kidding.
Anytime.
Just joking, but Yeah. So what we're going to focus on today, Kevin, as we talked about before we hit record, is navigating kind of the mental aspects of the ups and downs of entrepreneurship. And I know
Yeah.
you founded 4 companies, as you mentioned. I don't know when the first one was. So let's just dive in. What was the first company you started, and what did that look like?
Yeah, the first one. So I've been at it for a long time. So this spans a lot of
Sure.
years.
Sure.
The first company I started was an e-commerce company back in 1999. So those of you
Okay.
that are old enough to remember the
Yeah.
original .com boom or Web 1.0,
Yeah.
and it was a classic sort of venture capital backed software startup, and just to kind of jump ahead to the punchline, this
Yeah.
was the spectacular failure that I referenced earlier.
Mm.
It was my first startup. I was in my mid-20s, and in some ways, looking back on it, it was insane that to think about how little I knew, how immature I was. Yet, we were handed $15 million to go start this company,
Wow.
and they always say, like, you don't learn many lessons from your successes, but you sure learn from your failures. And
Sure.
I guess even though that, without getting into all the details, because we could spend a whole podcast talking about that one company,
Sure.
but the one of the lessons I took away from that is that mindset is everything. And when that company failed, it was a very tough period for me and my co-founder. And we reacted to that failure very differently. And I think it had a big impact. The way we reacted to that failure had a big impact over on the next few years for both of us. So it was an interesting sort of A/B test. I guess I'm fundamentally an optimist. So even in the moment, I chose to view it as a lesson, and a lot of, I called it my MBA on steroids, because in a literal sense, I decided to start that company instead of going to business school. I'd been
Sure.
accepted to several of the top business schools, was excited about that. We ended up starting this company instead. And boy, I think I learned a lot more by starting that company and ultimately failing than I would have in business school. But I think it's the way you choose to frame things has everything to do with, with how it impacts the rest of your life. And
Sure.
so these are, your mindset is super important.
No, that's really good. So I was going to ask that so for more context. You said mid-20s, so I'm assuming you were out of college at that point.
Mm-hmm.
So you hadn't had you ever had a quote unquote real job? Had you started your professional career, or was this the very start of it?
I had. So I came out of college and went into management consulting with one of the big firms. And I realized very quickly that was not for me. Even though I did learn a lot, it was kind of cool and felt glamorous at the time. That it was very unfulfilling. And I looked at the partners, the top guys on the food chain, and they were unhappy, unhealthy, working harder than anyone. And I guess I'll just take this opportunity to say, one thing that I guess I was always wired a little bit differently than my peers, in the sense that I never accepted this notion that you have to choose between having a great career and a great life. I don't know where that came from, but I will tell you, back in those days, like late 90s, early 2000s, like there was no talk about like work-life balance or lifestyle. Like you literally get laughed out of the office.
Yeah, that's for sure.
That stuff up. But I always was like, no, I actually think you do better work when you have a happier, healthier life. And so that was one of the things that drove me away early on from consulting, and it led to me and a friend of mine starting this first business. Was just that, like, that corporate life just didn't seem, especially in the consulting world, just didn't seem conducive to the overall life that I wanted to build.
Yeah, I love that. That's awesome. And then now, and I understand the big lesson was how you responded to that adversity. But looking back, what could you have done differently? Should you have chosen a different partner? Hopefully he doesn't listen to this, but no, I'm just kidding. But
no, it wasn't that.
As far as just kind of, maybe for the listener out there who's thinking of starting a business or starting their next project, what could you have done differently in setting up that business or operating that business?
Yeah. And before I answer that, I have to just make a caveat that, all of my experience has been in basically venture capital funded tech businesses. So that's
Okay.
a very different ball game than
Sure.
bootstrapping, a small business as an individual. It's
Sure.
just like the expectations, the pace, everything's different. And so, but I think some of the lessons do translate. And you had mentioned before this that this was a topic you might want to discuss. So I was thinking
Yeah.
about it last night, and I will tell you, Jamie, one thing over my career that I have been just blown away by and come to believe more and more strongly is the role of luck. And I mean, clearly we have an influence on the outcomes of the businesses we're involved in, businesses we
Sure.
start. But, being in the right place at the right time is everything. And so I've got a great example of that because, I do a lot of real estate investing. And so I've done it for, 15 plus years. And I have a lot of friends. And I'm just, by the way, I'm a passive investor. I just invest as a limited partner. But I've got a lot of friends who started real estate private equity firms right after the great financial crisis. So like maybe around 2010, they started a real estate private equity. And they just did it because that was the time when it made sense to start a company. They had come out of college or whatever. And they're smart people, hard workers. But the reality is from 2010 to 2021 or so, it was like shooting fish in a barrel. Like you couldn't miss in real estate. And so what happened was a lot of these guys who might have been successful anyway, what it did was it magnified their success 100x. I mean, I know I've more than one friend who made north of $100 million in that time period, which is just absurd. But it speaks to just like being, without really, even knowing it at the time, being in the exact right place at the exact right time. And so I think these external forces have a huge influence. I often refer to luck as the multiplier. So like, maybe it's like not ultimately the number one deterrent, although I think you could debate that. It certainly determines like the magnitude of the outcome. And so that's one lesson. The other lesson is, and this is a more specific to venture-backed startups where you actually have meaningful capital to go start your business, is to act like you didn't raise that money. Right. And so like you have 10 million bucks in the bank, which allows you to do all kinds of cool things. Like you can hire people, you can have a cool office space, whatever you want to do. But I think what happens in a lot of cases is you kind of get ahead of yourself. And I think in the early days, there's a friend of mine named Will, who's one of the smartest venture capitalists I know. And he talks a lot about like, when you start a company like that, you should try to do this absolute simplest experiment you can to determine whether the market is receptive to whatever it is you're building, whether you have product market fit. And often what founders tend to do, it's a temptation, is like you do a lot of building before you get to market. And ultimately customers and revenue are truth, right? And so you need to get to that truth as soon as humanly possible. The minimum viable product concept is very relevant here. And so that's, and unfortunately, it's a weird thing. Like I've actually had to learn that lesson the hard way a couple times. And a lot of entrepreneurs say the same thing. Is like, it's that temptation when you have money, it can actually become a negative. When you have when you have the resources, but you haven't proven out your product yet, that can become a conflict.
Got it. No, that's really good stuff. So you said essentially that you and your co-founder kind of reacted differently to the adversity you went through with that failure. How did that look, and how did that move you to your next venture?
Yeah, and I'll say, just to add a little color to that, I think because this is going to be a good insight, I think, for your listeners about how to think about their career. I think when my partner, he took it deeply personal when that company failed. And he truly viewed it as just an abject failure. And in some ways, that's hard to deny. But the way that I think the better way to look at it, and what I advise to everyone, is think of your career as a portfolio. If you try a bunch of things in your career, if you're doing bold things, you will not bat 1,000. Like, this is impossible. You will have successes, you will have failures. So think about it over the long course of time. Think of your career as like 30, 40 years, and think of it as like, you're going to have some ups, you're going to have some downs, but take what I call a portfolio view. It's like investing, right? If you invest in one stock, that stock may be successful or it may fail, But if you
Sure.
invest in a basket of stocks, you take a
Right.
portfolio view, and some will win, some will lose, but on the whole, you're going to do fine. And I
Sure.
think that's kind of how I was innately sort of wired that way, I guess, as I viewed it as like, well, we failed here. We learned a lot of lessons. We did the right things, to the best of our
Yeah.
ability.
Sure.
And so we're just going to move on and do something else now.
Yeah. It
And
sounds like there was a lot outside of your control, right? But you did the
always,
best
there's
you
always
could.
a lot of, and look, I don't mean to say that there's plenty of, I had plenty of, made plenty of mistakes, owned plenty of the fault for the failure of the business. But those are the most valuable lessons, is when you see something clearly that you could have done differently, you just don't
Sure.
repeat that.
Yeah,
And if you stay
absolutely.
at it, if you learn from your mistakes and you stay at it long enough, you will have some successes. Now, I also tell people, like, if you said something before we started recording that
Mhm.
I wrote down because I think it's so freaking true. Look,
Okay.
starting a business isn't for everyone.
Right.
Period. Like, in
Absolutely.
fact, I would go so far as to say starting a business isn't for 95% of people, maybe 99% of people, because it is a tough road. A lot of heartache lies down that road. It's not
Mhm.
as glamorous as it seems from the outside,
Yeah.
and you will have to deal. Inevitably, you'll probably have to deal with failure.
Mhm.
So I think that's a big thing for people to consider, is there's nothing at all wrong with having a great career in a 9 to 5 job.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
there's a way to build a great life around that. It's just that, I think the Elon Musk had an incredible quote about entrepreneurism. And he was giving a talk to some, I think it was like an MBA class or something. And
Mhm.
one of the students raised his hand and said, how do you start a business? And Elon's response was, if you have to ask, it's not for you. I think to start a business, it has to be something you can't
Right.
not do. It has to be just an itch you have to scratch.
Sure. That's really good.
Otherwise, and it goes back to another saying I like, which is like, it's one of those things that has to be either hell yes or no. If you're
Mm.
sort of like on the fence, the answer is no.
Sure. I love that. And I love that all of this just long-term and big picture perspective, not only just the career perspective, but this is one failure, one project in my long career of work, but also this is only my career and that fits in my whole life. So if you kind of zoom out at times, you're not always zoomed out, but if you zoom out and see, like, this is just one little blip.
That's right.
Um,
Mike,
yeah.
well, and just sorry to interrupt, but I think it's
Yeah.
an important point to make, especially for
Yeah.
men who we tend to allow our work to become our identity. And that's a
Sure.
very dangerous path, because, work is, an important, but it's only one part of your life. And there are equally important other pieces. So I think you have to be really deliberate about what you allow your identity to become.
I love that. Um, Yeah. So mentally, when it sounds like you kept things in perspective right away. Um, Tell us about your second. How did you transition into your second venture? Or did you go? The other thing I wanted to point out, I just came to me, was that life can have seasons, right? It's okay to. Doesn't mean you have to be a serial entrepreneur and never have a W-2. We've had guests on who were an entrepreneur for 20 years and then they became a W-2. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that either.
Yeah.
So maybe don't put this big pressure on yourself as an individual to define at age 22, am I an entrepreneur or am I an employee? It's okay to switch things up. What would you
Absolutely.
say
I'm a living
to that?
example of that. I mean, I've bounced back and forth between the corporate world and entrepreneurism multiple times in my career. So that's
Love it.
absolutely true.
So tell us about the second startup. How did that go?
Well, in the wake of that first startup, and this is another sort of piece of advice I'd give. Like, when I think when you try something entrepreneurial and it doesn't work, I don't think it's necessarily a good idea to jump right back into the fray. I think there's a
Mm,
recovery period.
mm,
And so I often recommend, like, I always say, I've told many people this, like, in the wake of like an entrepreneurial venture that didn't work out as you hoped,
sure.
attach yourself to a rocket ship. In other words, like, attach yourself to a company that's already got momentum, because
Mm,
you need to relearn what it feels like to have
mm,
momentum, to get some wins under your belt.
that's really
And
good.
so that, without really being intentional about it, I ended up doing that multiple times in my career. And eventually I observed in hindsight, it's like, oh, wow, it's an incredible way. Because the intensity is different, and just the the level of stress is different when you're a W-2, when you're working for somebody else. And that doesn't mean like you can't work hard, you're not working hard, you're doing great work, all that stuff. It's just different than when an entire company is on your shoulders.
Absolutely.
And it's it's just a knife fight day to day. So throughout my career, I've flip-flopped back and forth. And some of the other startups, companies I've started, I did take a little bit more of a bootstrap approach. Like in each case, we did raise money, but smaller amounts, really aimed at building companies that could get profitable very quickly.
Sure.
So I started like an ad tech firm that we ultimately sold. And then, I got lucky and was able to be, essentially one of the founders of an online lending company that we grew from 0 to 600 million or so in revenue. So an incredible success story. Wow. The company ultimately went public, then went back private. But that's really, probably my, that was about a 10-year run. Sure. And that was probably my most successful entrepreneurial venture, was, growing a business from essentially nothing to becoming a pretty big, successful, profitable company. And then after, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, so for the listener who maybe has a W-2 and they're thinking about starting a side hustle, and I understand venture capital is different than a bootstrap company, but I guess, what would you say to the listener out there who, should I start a side hustle? Should I just jump and go all in? And I guess it gets to the Elon Musk answer as well. But looking back when you're a great person to ask this to, is because you switched back and forth so many times. Should you do a side hustle? Should you do both at the same time? Should I just pick one or the other? How would you frame that answer?
So I wrote something about this pretty recently. There's a hugely mistaken notion out there that you have to sort of bet it all to start a business. And that is absolutely not true. If you look at the smartest, most successful people, they make what I call asymmetric bets, meaning that they're actually taking surprisingly little risk in whatever they do, but their upside is unlimited. And, what are the ways that you mitigate that risk, right? So the classic story, right, is like, I left my W-2, I invested all my savings in this thing, I ran up all my credit cards to their limit. And the problem is that makes for a great story when the outcome is success. But the problem is 9 out of 10, the outcome is not success, and it's disastrous. And it can take years, if not decades, or rest of your life to recover from that. So I think one thing I would urge anybody who's, contemplating starting a new business is to make the opportunity as asymmetric as possible. How do you contain the risk while not impacting your upside? Well, one is that's why entrepreneurs raise money, right? And so that's, one of the big reasons I've chosen to raise money for all of my ventures. You can share the risk with others who are willing to, they understand the risk and they're willing to share it with you because they see the upside as well. The other is simple things like, when you start a business, make sure that you've got your personal finances are in order so that, you're not having, so that even if it fails, it's not disastrous. It could be as simple as having a year in savings or whatever, or choose your opportunity based on, you don't have to pull a rabbit out of a hat to make it work. Choose a business that is already proven, where you don't have to do anything necessarily super novel to make it work. And so that, I think that's the number one lens I would look at it through. I would encourage people to look at it through is this an asymmetric opportunity?
Sure. And those are really good ways to mitigate that risk that you just listed there. That's awesome. Okay. So it sounds like the third of your 4 ventures was the home run, right?
Yeah. And I guess, I've sold a few, but in terms of like starting a company and then having it go really big, that was definitely the biggest success story.
That's awesome. And just for a little bit more context with relation to your own life and family and everything like that, when was this in your life?
So this was when I joined this company, it was in 2005. And the reason I know that is because we in that, and this is a great example of like taking bold steps. The world belongs to the bold. When I joined that company, it required a relocation.
Okay.
We had just had our first baby. Our first child was 3 months old, and I was taking a big new job and stepping into the unknown, to help, kind of build this company. And so we did, I called it the big three. And so that was kind of the life situation at the time.
Sure.
And so, we were all in, and, that was definitely a period of my like, look, when your kids are young, when you're trying to make something happen in your career, there's no avoiding the fact that you have to be heads down and just grind for a while.
Absolutely.
And, people, one mistake a lot of people make on Twitter is they see my life today, which, I will say I have a kick-ass life for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
But what they're seeing is the end product. They're not seeing the process and the work it took to get there, literally decades of work it took to get there. Yeah. So you mentioned this idea of seasons of life, and I'm a big advocate of that. Is like, embrace each season for what it is. And, when your kids are young and you're trying to make something happen in your career, that season is just, it's a season where you're working hard, like you're grinding. It can be tough.
Sure.
And then, but recognize that it is a season, and it not only should come to an end, but it has to come to an end if you want to have a great life.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I always like to say, like, at the end of the day, hard work is undefeated. And so, like, there's, a lot of talk these days about lifestyle and balance and blah, blah, blah. But the reality is, getting ahead takes really hard work. Now you can put that in the context. Like, again, if you take that portfolio view, that's just a season of life. Yeah. And you're building towards something that is, that is different and better down the road.
Well, how do you navigate? Because you've obviously done a great job of looking at the big picture, looking at the long-term, taking a long-term portfolio view of your life, not just your career, but it seems like you're always living in the moment as well. Right. And so how do you personally navigate those two, do you once a week look at the big picture and then the rest of the time live in the moment, or how do you navigate that?
No, I'll tell you, and this is my opportunity to start plugging rock climbing. But I was introduced to rock climbing by a friend of mine in 2000. Sorry, so it was like right in the wake of that first startup when we failed. Just serendipitously got introduced to rock climbing. I fell in love with it immediately. What I'll say is rock climbing, and there's other hobbies that are like this. It spoke to me beyond just being a form of exercise. I thought it was an incredible blend of like physical challenge and mental challenge. It takes you to amazing places, but most of all, the community was amazing, because in that community, it's a community where no one cares what your title is. No one cares how much money you make. And the reason I bring this up as an answer to your question is it really changed my life in a very profound way, because I realized, here's something else that I can build an identity in, that at the end of the day, if my business fails, I can still go rock climbing. And
that's an excellent point. Yeah.
Yes. So I preach a lot about this, and I call it being multidimensional. And what I mean by multidimensional is there are multiple facets to your life where your identity resides. And again, men, much more than women are better at this, but men tend to tie their identity, like 90% of it is tied to their work. And I'll tell you, even if you're wildly successful, that becomes a problem. I have one friend in particular he's one of the guys I mentioned who's made like a 9-figure sum of money. And he's in his challenge is like, what's next? My entire identity is my work. I'm no longer finding that as fulfilling as I used to. Yeah. And it's a real problem, I'll tell you. Yeah. And so I'm a huge believer in intentionally building a multidimensional life where your identity is sort of spread across multiple things.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah. We had a guest on, Josh Kalinowski just came to mind. He was a professional baseball player. He got, actually in Colorado, and, got injured, and he was a pitcher, was doing really well, got injured, career-ending injury. His entire world was rocked. And I actually could relate to that on some level as well. I played lacrosse in college and was pretty good, and whatever, this is the glory days we're talking about, right? But at the end, your season's over, your career's over. Now what?
Yeah.
I can definitely relate to.
Well,
That's an easy thing for me to relate to for sure.
I'll tell you a story related to what you just said. So one of my best friends is a former NFL player, had a wildly successful career. I mean, was, at the, in his position was one of the top guys, made an obscene amount of money. When he retired, he found himself to be profoundly bored, and it was a huge problem. And it sounds like, to someone who hasn't been in that position, it's like, come on, give me a break. You're wealthy, you're retired at an early age, you have complete control of your time, and your biggest problem is you're bored. But it actually is a real problem. Like, I always say that all of us, no matter how wealthy or poor we are, we have to fill 16 waking hours a day with meaning. And if you don't, you're miserable, no matter how much money you have. Yeah, and so I think that's a profound insight, because even if you don't have millions of dollars in the bank, you can fill those 16 hours with a lot of meaning, in some ways, just as much meaning as a billionaire can have.
Yeah, that's really good. No, and I love the back to the rock climbing thing, just the community aspect has been such a central theme on our show. Whether you're going through adversity or abundance, it's all about other people and you said relationships and experiences. I found that to be a common theme with all of our guests who have overcome adversity or gotten to abundance. Now, everyone's story is different, but in some way, they're always plugged into, part of their success story is the fact that they were plugged into a community, or they were focused on others. They were serving others. It wasn't all about Kevin Dahlstrom, wasn't all about Jamie Bateman, because at the end of the day, that's not fulfilling. So I love the community aspect as well.
Well, and I love, I remember when we did the first recording of your podcast, I was, what hooked me into doing it was really just the title of it, Adversity to Abundance, because I think that's a great subject matter to explore. And what I've learned over the years, and this sounds really hokey to say, people will roll their eyes, but it really is true, that it's actually just a choice. Like, we think of adversity to abundance as circumstances. It's actually just a choice that you make. And you either view your life as one of abundance, or you view it as one of adversity, and that will dictate your future.
I love that. That's fantastic. So it sounds like, so Swell was your most recent venture. And can you talk about how that went and how the exit went for you?
Yeah. So Swell was a fintech startup that we actually spun out of a larger company. We spun it out of a public bank. And the idea was to reinvent consumer banking. And it was we were specifically starting with the credit card problem. Credit cards are arguably the consumer finance problem of our time. We're right at $1 trillion in credit card debt in the US. The average rate is APR is north of 20%. It's a huge financial burden for Americans, and we're not making progress on it. So we went after that space, and it was interesting because we started the company officially in around February of 2022. And, fintech, our space was the hottest space in venture capital. The market was still roaring. And everything was roses. And then talk about adversity. Later in 2022, we all know what happened, right? The market turned. In particular, venture capital shut down, essentially, still is essentially shut down. My space, fintech, went from being the darling of venture capital to a bad word. And then on top of it, for us, we were a banking startup. The banking crisis happened, and that directly affected us. So it really changed our trajectory. You talk about the role of luck and right place at the right time. It felt like the world turned around on us. And the good news is we were able to find a soft landing or a nice exit for Swell. It certainly wasn't, we set out to build $1 billion company. It wasn't that, but it was a great outcome, all things considered. And so, I take a lot of pride in this one, actually, maybe more than my bigger successes, because, like when everything's going great, anybody can find a nice exit. But when things are tough, can you find an exit? And what you're seeing right now is most of my peers and most startups, frankly, are dropping like flies. In fact, I'm personally an investor in about 50 startups. I've been an angel investor for a long time. I just got a letter yesterday from a CEO of one of the most promising companies I invested in. It was a robotics company for the home. Really cool products, incredible. Their team came from Apple and Tesla. They had raised a truckload of money, like had everything going for it. They were unable to raise another round, and they had to fold operations.
Wow.
And so it's happening left and right. So the lesson for me from Swell was like around, when things don't go well, how do you navigate that? And, I would say like, it's as a CEO, like it's, especially of a venture-backed startup, it's like reducing your burn rate. It's like trying to position yourself and pivot a little bit so that you have, so that your aperture of opportunity doesn't completely close on you. And so that's actually a much harder thing to navigate than when you're getting real, like, strong traction with customers.
Yeah, no, there's a ton of truth there. And there's not going to be the clickbait for this story that you wanted, or I wanted, whatever, but there's so much truth to what you just said. It could have been so much worse for sure. So, okay. Now I'm sure you're working on some things. I've got some other questions here. Don't worry, but what's the future look like for you right now?
Yeah. I was joking earlier that, I guess technically I'm fun employed, which is great. I mean, for the first time in my life, but the irony is, like, the pace has not slowed down at all. Like in the, the Swell transaction closed at the end of May. And so I guess it's been, what is it, July 19th today. So it's been nearly 2 months. And I haven't really been able to slow down and smell the roses yet. Some of that is just because that's how I roll. Like, I'm kind of wired that way. But even, for a long time, I've had a lot of things going on outside of my day-to-day job. I mentioned I do a lot of real estate investing. I also do quite a bit of, private equity, angel, and other types of private equity investing. And I do a lot of like advisory work for some other companies. And actually, as of yesterday, I just agreed. I can't talk a lot about the details, but talk about attaching yourself to a rocket ship. I've through mutual friends met a founder who's got a company that in the past 5 years has gone from zero to they'll do almost 200 million in revenue this year. It's unbelievable, just a rocket ship. And they're having all the struggles that you expect to have when you go from nothing to becoming all of a sudden like a really successful company. And so I'm going to advise this company. It's going to be a blast, actually. Just
That's awesome.
An incredible team. And that's a great example of, like, me, in the wake of, a startup, which, Swell, which is, it's balls to the wall 24/7. Now to be able to be in more of an advisory role where someone else is really carrying the burden of day-to-day leadership, being the CEO, but I can just help out in, with the things that I know and the things that I can do well. It's a great kind of, recovery period, or just a way to kind of shift gears a bit for a while.
Yeah. You can still make a big impact, but maybe not do all the heavy lifting. And, And
again, now back to this idea of being asymmetric, for me, it's an incredibly asymmetric, I get paid to do this stuff, and there's a lot of upside in, attaching myself to a company that's having wild success like this.
Yeah. But you alluded to the fact that this company obviously still has challenges. And that's one of the things I think people on the outside of entrepreneurship, entrepreneurialism, like, don't understand, is that it doesn't matter the size of the company. There's always a problem, lots and lots of problems and challenges within any company. So,
well, that's the thing people need to understand about being a CEO of a company of any size. Because I've been in multi-billion-dollar companies and I've been in ground floor startups. The CEO job, all it is a never-ending series of problems. Like, there is no glamour to being a CEO. Yeah, you get these occasional fleeting moments of success, but 95% of the day-to-day job of being a CEO is just fighting fires.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
that's really good. There was I don't have it in front of me, but there was a quote from Brent Beshore about the chaos within every organization. It's a fantastic quote. All right, you ready for some rapid fire questions?
Yeah, you bet. Bring
All right, let's do it. What's one thing that people misunderstand about you, Kevin?
Wow, going deep right off the bat. I think I would say that I'm a very high energy guy. And I believe in this concept of strong opinions loosely held. And a lot of times people perceive the strong opinions as being sort of overly forceful, or I'm not open to other ideas. But the secret of people who are wired like I am, a lot of times, I'm an Enneagram 8 for people who know the Enneagram system. We share this trait, which is we love to be challenged. And often if in a business environment, when you see someone who has really strong opinions, it's counterintuitive, but those are often the people who most enjoy being challenged, because that's how people like that's how we shape our thinking.
Yeah.
So when I come in and I'm passionately laying out an idea, that doesn't mean I'm certain about the idea, even though it may seem that way. It means I'm throwing it out there and I want you to help me shape it by poking holes in it, offering different points of view, and so on.
Absolutely. Love it. I actually just had Nick Huber on the show, and he has something on his mirror. He said that tells him, I need to change my mind every day.
He's actually an incredible example of that, because he actually purposely throws out things he doesn't even necessarily believe in. Now, I don't take it to that extreme. Like, I generally do believe in what I'm saying, but it is absolutely a way to, and Nick's a great example of someone who gets a lot of criticism for some of the stuff he posts, but he's one of the people I know who is most open to new ideas and to change.
Got it. That's awesome. If you could have coffee with any historical figure, who would it be?
Ooh,
doesn't have to be your favorite. It could be one of, 10 people who you would like to have coffee with.
Yeah. Trying to think. These are deep questions, Jamie. And and by the way, whenever I do these, I like to give the real answer. So I often take a moment to think about it. The name that popped into my mind immediately isn't really a historical figure, but I'm thinking of today, who would I have coffee with? It'd probably be Elon Musk. I mean, I'm an unabashed Elon fanboy. I think we need 1,000 more Elons in this world who are just thinking. I think one thing that's been lost over the past, let's call it 50 years, is just it's almost like our imagination has been lost. A lot of the smartest minds these days aren't working on moonshot things. And this world needs more moonshot ideas and across all industries. And Elon is, arguably one of 3 people in the world who, is only interested in moonshots. And so, that would probably be the person I would choose.
Yeah. I agree. And it's so easy for people to criticize, some of the shortcomings he's had, but it's, but they're doing that from their couch.
Yeah. I mean, you're criticizing arguably the greatest entrepreneur of all time, certainly of our era, but maybe of all time.
Sure. If you were given $10 million tomorrow, Kevin, I'm not saying you don't have $10 million, but if you were given $10 million tomorrow, what would you do with it?
Yeah. I have a funny story related to exactly this. And it's, I have to caveat it all by saying, look, I've been at it for a long time. I've been fortunate to have a lot of financial success. And I don't take that for granted. Don't take it lightly. But my marriage is a very traditional marriage where I have certain duties. My wife has certain duties, and they're kind of the traditional, husband, wife, father, mother roles. And so my wife really doesn't get very involved in my business stuff. Frankly, isn't even that interested, which I like that about her. The last thing I want to talk about at the end of the day is more business stuff sometimes. Sure. So anyway, we're sitting in bed one night. This was actually not that long ago, less than a year ago. And she said, she asked me that question. She said, man, what would you do if you had X million dollars? And she didn't know, but I was in my head. I was like, you have a lot more than that, actually. That's hilarious. And the reality is, I wouldn't change a thing, because I mentioned earlier, I'm already living exactly the life I want to live. Sure. I realized, and this is almost like the secret to life in some ways, is if you really are deliberate about thinking through, I call it your ideal end state life, literally bullet out, what is that? What does your day look like if you've got, if money wasn't a limitation, or if you could have any things in you? What you realize when you really do that soul searching is a lot of the things on your list don't take a lot of money. And I'll give you a great example. For me, it involves a lot of rock climbing, and which costs nothing, and spending time with family and friends, and, traveling a little bit, which doesn't have to be super expensive either. And then doing work that's challenging and fulfilling. I'm not trying to escape work. I want to do work that actually challenges where there's struggle, there's uncertainty. And so, the short answer, roundabout way of answering, like, I would live the life I have today.
Yeah. And that's because you've been intentional about doing that exercise of what do you want your life to look like?
Right. But got a late start on that. I mean, I did allow myself, as I described earlier, to be pulled down that path of, the standard path. And, I rebooted in my mid 40s, and a part of the mission of my Twitter account is to help people have this awakening earlier in life, so they don't have to be 45 when they pull the plug on everything.
Yeah. I love that. That's awesome. How about a book or two that you could recommend for my listener?
Oh man. One of my friends, Chris Powers, posted something on Twitter the other day. He said, I finish maybe 1 out of 10 books that I start. And that's the same for me. As I download a lot of books. I've actually been reading, I'd have to look up the title of it because I can't remember, but I've been reading a lot lately, just in terms of genres or subjects, just about like the role of man and woman, feminine and masculine, because that's obviously a topical thing these days.
Sure
and
is.
What is masculine energy? What is feminine energy? And I think some of the debate we're having, and some of the, in my view, some misguided notions out there are becoming huge societal problems that
I couldn't agree more.
As you know, I often say, like, everything's connected. Like you can't separate, like, even as an individual, like who you are in your personal life is the same as you are in your work life, and your health is connected to that, and your political beliefs. So everything's connected, and not only is connected, but impacts everything else. So I think we're seeing a lot of that in society, where just like, in some ways, society is becoming more and more sick because of just some things that we are, asked to believe that simply aren't true.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I love that you just have a very, kind of refreshing, I guess, approach to these types of topics, because I think what a lot of people think is that people that may hold more traditional views are super judgmental and they think they're better than everyone. And, I don't see it that way at all. I mean, so you're actually being bold and even stating that perspective on some level. So,
well, and thank you for the compliment. And I do like to think of myself as, first and foremost, I'm a truth seeker. Like I'm back to the strong ideas loosely held. I may have strong opinions, but the moment I realize I'm wrong or outdated or whatever, I will change them.
Sure.
But at the same time, like, I've been around for a while. I'm not wrong all that often. And so, a lot of my approach to life is really just like intuition and common sense about what works and what doesn't. Sure. And there's a lot of just absurdity in the world today, on both ends of the spectrum, by the way. I'm not pointing fingers at like the left or the right or whatever.
Yeah.
It's just like a lot of absurdity out there. I also have this fundamental belief that most people are not at the extremes. Most people are good human beings who want to help their fellow man and want to get along. But we've lost sight of that. Social media magnifies the extremes. And I just think we need a return to more moderate thinking.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely. So speaking of Twitter, before we wrap up here, Kevin, what are some of the more viral tweets that you've had, or, what are the topics that seem to really energize people?
Yeah. Well, first of all, a lot of us who are on Twitter, we joke that, like, there'll be a tweet or a thread that you put hours of work into, you put it out into the world, and it gets no engagement. And then you're sitting on the toilet and you have some brain fart, you put it out there, it goes super viral. A great example for me is, the other day I posted a picture. We bought this like pellet ice maker for our home because my kids have insisted they have to have pellet ice in their
I saw this. I commented on this one too. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's probably my most viral post ever. but look, the truth is, my policy on Twitter, which is definitely different than most people. I am not on Twitter to necessarily grow a following, although certainly I love it. It's like an ego boost. Sure. But from day one, when I started writing on Twitter, I enjoy writing. I think it's the best way to sharpen thinking. And so it's almost like my personal journal. So I write first and foremost for myself. And if others like it, of course, I love that. But I've stuck to that. Even as I've grown my following, my only litmus test for what I post is, am I proud of it? And if I'm proud of it, then I'm happy no matter how much engagement it gets. And it turns out that, some of the things I've written have resonated with other people. So that's great.
Definitely. That's awesome. Yeah. I highly recommend people follow you on Twitter. It's a gold mine for sure. So,
Thanks.
What else, Kevin? What have we not covered that you want to touch on?
Man, we covered a lot of ground. I don't know.
We did. We
again,
did.
Jamie, I like what you dig into in this podcast. I think it's like this idea of adversity to abundance is a universal problem we all think about. Yeah. And I guess I would leave your listeners with something, just reiterating something I said earlier, which is when you get to be old like me, you've had successes, you've had failures, you've done a lot of things. You realize that how your choices and your beliefs are so self-fulfilling. So, abundance is absolutely a choice. It's a mindset that becomes self-fulfilling. It can change your circumstances immediately, but it will also impact your circumstances in the future.
That's so good. That's great. You on Twitter, you are at Camp4.
Yes.
Is that where you direct everyone, or is there any?
That's right. Yeah. So interestingly, you back to kind of, you asked like, what's next for you?
Yeah.
So my Twitter handle is at Camp4. Where that came from is that's the historic climbers campground at Yosemite National Park, which I think is the most beautiful place on earth. And I am actually thinking about, I've got a bunch of ideas in the hopper for sort of leveraging the personal brand. I hate that word, but like the personal brand that I've built with Camp4, leveraging it into other things. I'm running a really cool experiment that I can't talk about yet, but we should regroup. And the experiment is happening September 6th and 7th. So we should regroup after that, and I'll talk about it. It's a super cool thing I'm doing to kind of leverage the following and the brand I've built on Twitter. Yeah. And that's one of about 2 or 3 things that I'm experimenting with that really is like just about like aligning my work with my personal mission.
Well, I'm not surprised you got a few projects in the hopper. So
yeah.
But Kevin, this has been I truly mean this has been fantastic. I mean, yeah, I don't listen to every episode of my own podcast, I'll be honest. Maybe with 7 episodes, you might listen to everyone.
I do, yeah.
I don't listen to everyone, but I'm definitely going to listen to this one for sure. So
awesome.
Thanks a lot, Kevin. This has been fantastic. Really appreciate you
taking
the time. And to the listener out there, thank you for spending your most valuable resource, like Kevin said, spending your time with us. We appreciate that. And make sure you check out our podcast website, which is adversity2, abundance.com. Thanks, everyone. Take care.